So I was told that we sit at the table to start, but when we give 20 minutes each, we go up there, and then for the other more conversational discussion with questions, we can stay here. Does that make sense?
On higher things.
Oh, I don't mind. I'll be on the right if you like. Would you want? Yeah. You want to be on the right? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, fine.
Good evening, and welcome to our inaugural annual conversation. My name is Gordon Priest, and I'm the director of RASP, which is the full version of that is the University of Divinity Centre for Research in Religion and Social Policy, but RASP for short, which is a little kind of instrument that you use. It's a bit like iron sharpening iron, and tonight's going to be an exercise in that iron sharpening iron kind of process. In a week when there's much discussion in the light of the 2016 census results of a possible diminishing role of religion in relationship to Australian social life and policy, RASP's role is to foster fruitful discussion on that complicated relationship status, as Facebook might say. This is illustrated in your pamphlets that I hope you've picked up as you were coming in. If you didn't, perhaps if you'd like to pick one up on the way out. You'll see our logo has an A shape in the tip of the iceberg up there for the public engagement, the visible kind of process, and down below underneath the waterline is the research that goes on and then sometimes comes out onto public display. The A stands for AND, religion and social policy, and the links and the integration between those two areas. We're very open to civil, ecumenical, as the University of Divinity is an ecumenical organisation of a range of 10 colleges of a range of different Christian traditions. We're open to dialogue and debate with people of non-faith and multi-faith, on significant social issues, like tonight's topic of end-of-life choices. In a time of echo chamber kind of isolation, those kinds of social constructive dialogues are relatively rare, or sometimes we find mismatched token or straw men or women put up in terms of public debate or dialogue. But tonight we're privileged to have two outstanding international Australian public intellectuals in Professors Singer and Somerville, and John Cleary will say a bit more about them in just a moment. And we have a renowned media facilitator of such engagement for more than 30 years on the ABC in John Cleary. Please note that to get your questions to the speakers via John Uren, who will be helping us up the back there with Meg, our event organiser. You need to basically send them by email to RASP, that's R-A-S-P, as it is on the banner, at divinity.edu.au, and to get them in by 6:40, please. So a person who's kind of selecting from them has to go to another event at that stage. One key area that tonight's topic fits in, a key area of our research, we have three main areas, ecology, economy and wellness or health. We look for what enables human flourishing in a fragmenting world in relationship to life and also in relationship to death. But I mentioned there are other areas like ecology, for instance. So on July the 19th, that evening, again kindly hosted by Collins Street Baptist, who have been very generous and kind to us, we'll have the British biblical and ecological scholar David Horrell responding to the Australian Clive Hamilton's recent book, Defiant Earth, The Fate of Humans in the Anthropocene, in the human-centred age, or humans basically profoundly impacting the wider ecology. And in turn, that'll be responded to by Anne Elvey and hopefully by a rabbi as well. Another free event is the British scholar Keith Clement's address on priorities for republic theology in a time of extremisms, fresh insights from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Christian martyr under Hitler a week before the war ended. And that's Thursday the 10th of August, 6 to 8 p.m. at Whitley College at Parkville. If you want details, there are some sheets about that on the back table as you leave, or contact Centre RASP, just as it sounds, centreRASP.org, and you'll see the details there. Or in the pamphlet, you'll be able to at least find the address. If you can bear for a moment just with some basic operational matters. The toilets are off the foyer area, up the front entrance as you head out to your right, and there's one there. If you're desperate, you can sort of run the gauntlet to go down here. There's a big queue up there, but I'd kind of recommend going up the back in the first place. Otherwise, people might think you've come out for baptism, perhaps. The emergency gathering area is on Collins Street, and follow the green exit signs, basically leading to where you came in. That's the simplest way. If you have some sort of disability in terms of mobility, then please see me sort of up the front down there, and you will be halfway to the disability exit. Either see me or, Meg's in a different position now, so don't see her. See me down the front. That'll be the best way, and I'll guide you there. I'd now like to welcome the Chair of RASP, the distinguished Chair, Gabriel McMullen, to make the acknowledgement to Indigenous ancestors and elders on our behalf, and then it will be over to John Cleary. Thank you.
I wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land we are gathered this evening. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We gather here with an awareness of the primacy of the First Peoples of this land, who have been custodians of this country for many thousands of years. We acknowledge the importance of mutual respect and understanding, and the benefits of a close and informed relationship. We are committed to furthering reconciliation and to ensuring that the First Peoples of this nation are valued for their contribution to Australian life.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this event, and I think the size of the crowd really does indicate the extent to which Victorians are taking quite seriously the debate which is before us in public today. Tonight it's a real privilege for me to be here, but it's a privilege also for us to have two of Australia's most distinguished public intellectuals leading us in this discussion, Margaret Somerville and Peter Singer, both of whom are recognised on the international stage for their perspectives on bioethics. And it's appropriate because the topic being addressed is one that has or will confront us all, not just as an academic discussion or even a political one for the chambers of Parliament, but indeed it will affect us where it matters most, in the hearts, homes and lives of ourselves and our loved ones. And I guess that is a significant part of the reason why each of you is here this evening. For me, for example, serious reflection on this issue did not begin in ethics seminars at university, though conducted by eminently sensible and worthy folk. But when I saw the stage play in London in the late 1970s, Tom Conti, in Whose Life Is It Anyway?, in which he was immobilised by accident from the neck down and had an ongoing discussion with a nurse about many of the issues we're confronting this evening. It became personal, however, when my mother, over a period of around 5 years, suffered a series of micro-strokes in the base of her brain, which left her without balance, unable to even read without extreme dizziness caused by her eye movement across the page, and in continuous pain, but without any visible physical impairment. In her early 80s, she was admitted once again to hospital and realising, after doctors' advice and her own weakness, that she could no longer sustain life independently in her own home, over 2 or 3 days quietly passed away, surrounded by her family. During this process, I would occasionally chat to the doctor, and a few minutes after she died, her doctor, who'd known her for some years, spoke quietly to me and said, "Physically, your mother was quite strong. Her body may well have gone on, but like a lot of older people who are suffering, I think she just decided it was time to go." Nothing more was said. I simply nodded, thanked him, and left. Here I am a couple of decades later, still wrestling with that. What was being said to me? The doctor had earlier told me that he was upping the morphine to ease her discomfort. What do I now reflect on that conversation, given what I now understand about the way the world works? And what do I read into that based on my knowledge of my mother and her quietly stoic view of life? I know she was exhausted and had enough, but I also know she was a person who was determined to set her way of dealing with life. My story and the experience of my sister and others is something that's not unfamiliar. Many of you would have a similar experience. And so tonight, for our discussion, Margaret and Peter will speak for 20 minutes. Peter will speak first. Margaret Somerville will then respond. Following their presentations, we'll have a brief discussion in which each will be invited to question directly and clarify issues amongst ourselves here on the stage. And after that, your questions. And I'll remind you again, if you have a question, don't switch off your mobile phone. Get busy and email your question to RASP, and those questions will be sorted and presented to me so that we can ask them at the end. Both Margaret and Peter have given considerable time and thought and energy to the matters coming before us in public and with the Parliament of Victoria over the next few months. Let me first then, this evening, introduce Professor Peter Singer. He could be described as an eminent philosopher, which indeed he is, but equally in the great tradition of our Aussie larrikin stirrers. Peter has never backed off from a discussion, debate, and since he first came to prominence with his book Animal Liberation back in 1975, he's gone on to a career marked by both academic discussion and public controversy across the globe. Would you please welcome Professor Peter Singer.
Thank you very much, John. I also want to thank Gordon Priest and everyone else who's been involved in setting up this event. I think this is just the kind of occasion that we should have, discussion that we should have in the light of impending legislation in Victoria. But before I get on to that particular aspect of it, since John gave you this alternative descriptions of me as a philosopher or as a larrikin, I want to start by proving that I truly am a philosopher. So I'm going to start with the deeper philosophical questions that this issue raises, and then I want to come to the more specific issues about physician-assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia and the legislation that the Victorian government is likely to propose before the end of the year. Okay, so what are these philosophical questions? Well, we are talking about proposals that will permit essentially contributing to, or at least being complicit in some way, the death of another human being, and this is an innocent human being that we're talking about. So we're not talking about capital punishment or killing in war. We're talking about somebody who is innocent. And we generally have the view that killing is wrong, killing of an innocent human being is wrong, it's a bad thing, that we ought to try to prevent the deaths of innocent human beings rather than to assist in bringing them about. But as a philosopher, I think we can't just take those things for granted. We can't just say, well, yes, of course, killing an innocent human being is wrong, and not ask why is it wrong, because asking why it is wrong may lead us to understand that there may be some circumstances in which it's not wrong. And that's what I want to start out by showing. So let's just ask that question, the thing we normally take for granted. Why is it normally wrong for one human being to kill another, an innocent human being? And I think there are two main reasons why we should think of that as wrong. One is that it is a violation of that person's autonomy. Normal human beings are capable of making choices. To kill somebody takes away their choice in whether or not they're going to go on living, and therefore all of the other choices that they might have made as well. And we think of autonomy as an important value, and killing violates it, therefore it's wrong. And secondly, killing deprives the person killed of the rest of their life, and we tend to think of human life as positive under normal circumstances again. So it's a bad thing to kill somebody because you take away from them all of the good things that they might have had in their life. So let's look at these two important reasons why normally killing is wrong and ask, do they always apply? So starting with the idea of autonomy as something that we want to respect people's autonomy. One case in which that is not going to apply is if the person makes a considered request to die. If a person makes such a request and it isn't simply a momentary whim or a jest or something like that, and it isn't a result of some mental disturbance, some lack of mental competence to understand what they're asking for or why they're asking for it, then, in fact, to assist that person to die, if that is their well-considered request, is not a violation of their autonomy. On the contrary, you could argue that to refuse to assist is contrary to their autonomy. Which is not to say that it's always wrong to refuse to assist, but it's just to say that the refusal cannot be justified by saying, I respect that person's autonomy. Autonomy is really important and we should not violate it. That clearly can't justify the refusal, because here we have an autonomous agent who is saying, I want to die, I've thought about this, I am clear in my head, I'm mentally competent, I'm of the age of majority, so I'm competent to make those decisions, and so that is my autonomous choice. That's a circumstance, therefore, where this first important reason why killing is wrong clearly does not apply. Now, I'm not saying that autonomy always overrides everything, every other value. There may be occasions where we should think, no, there's too much at stake here, this person will change their mind if we wait a bit longer, and they'll be justified in changing their mind. So, for example, if a young person tells you that the person that they love no longer loves them and everything that gives meaning to their life is gone, and therefore life is not worth living and therefore they want to die, I don't think we should assist such a person in carrying out that decision. We should recognise from long experience that this happens to people. It's very sad, but almost always they get over it. Almost always they recover. They find someone else, or they realise that they can live independently without someone else, and they consider their life worthwhile, and they are actually glad that they were not able to or didn't act on that judgment. So that's a clear example, I think, where we ought not to respect autonomy under every possible circumstance, but normally it is a good thing, and normally we should respect it. The second reason why killing someone is normally wrong, as I've said, is because it deprives them of all of the good things in their life that they're going to have. And that's perhaps why we normally think that the death of a young person in an accident, or for that matter through violence, through murder, is a greater tragedy than the death of someone who was close to the end of their life. Somebody, let's say, in their 90s. We think that's still sad, it's still a bad thing, it's still obviously a crime, but it's not as great a tragedy as the death of someone in their 20s who had so much more to look forward to. But now, if we consider somebody who actually does not have anything to look forward to, whose future is certain to be one in which they are going to suffer for the rest of the time they have, which perhaps is not going to be very long anyway, or if maybe there are going to be some positive moments in that life, they have, perhaps it's, as you just heard from John Cleary with a story about his mother, perhaps it's constant nausea, perhaps it's loss of independence and the sense that you don't want to live if you can't be independent, if you're helpless, if you're dependent on others, perhaps it's loss of dignity. All of those things might be reasons why people think that their life no longer, on balance, holds more good things than bad things. And if that is the case, if they're reasonable in making that judgment, of course we may not in their circumstances make exactly the same judgment, but we might see that other people could, and that's a reasonable choice for them to make. We recognise that normally individuals are in the best position to judge their own interests in these sorts of circumstances. Then, the second reason why it's normally wrong to end a life also does not apply. And what you can obviously see that I'm now leading up to is that there are some circumstances in which people make end-of-life choices in which these two important reasons why it's wrong to kill, or even why we regard a death as a tragedy, as a bad thing, do not apply. And these are just the circumstances where, for example, somebody is terminally ill, let's say they're suffering from cancer, and their health has deteriorated to a point where they feel that the good things that they're enjoying in life are no longer there, they're no longer capable of doing the things that they want to do, and they recognise that it's only going to get worse from there, that it's only going to go downhill from there. So in those circumstances, both respect for autonomy and the sense of, is this a reasonable choice in terms of, is the person giving up something that on balance is clearly good, both of those are reasons for assisting the person in that choice not to continue to live, rather than saying, no, killing is wrong, assisting death is wrong, I can't do anything about that. And it's significant, I think, and again, John Cleary's story illustrated that, that these decisions are already being made, or at least his story suggested that that may have been the case with his mother, that these decisions are already being made by doctors all the time, that they are assisting patients to die, either, as perhaps was the case with John Cleary's mother, by giving injections of morphine, which in such doses that they shorten life, hasten death, or perhaps simply by withdrawing treatment. A person on a respirator withdrawing life support, or a person develops pneumonia and not giving antibiotics to treat. Now this happens all the time, and it happens in countries that do not legalise physician-assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia. In fact, when I was at Monash many years ago, together with Helga Kuser, who I see is in the audience tonight, we carried out a survey, and with Peter Baum of University of New South Wales, a respected doctor and former health minister, we carried out a survey of Australian doctors, which showed that many of them acknowledged that they had brought about the deaths of their patients in those ways. So when you hear, as I suspect you might hear later tonight, that in some countries that have legalised voluntary euthanasia, there have been cases in which death has been brought about without the patient's consent, just remember that. Remember, in fact, that you just heard from our host, and I didn't know who was going to say this until he said it just a few minutes ago. You just heard from our host of a case in Australia that was, in his view, quite possibly a case of euthanasia without consent. Because although the doctor, if you like, guessed or intuited that John's mother wanted to die at that point, there was no suggestion that there was a discussion about that, and indeed, if this is not legal, doctors are not going to discuss it with their patients. The doctor just does what he or she believes the patient wants. And so, if that were a case that had happened, say, in the Netherlands, that would have been acknowledged in the surveys that the government bodies took as a case of euthanasia without consent. But don't think that it only happens in countries with legal voluntary euthanasia. It's happening here right now, as you've just heard, and in many other cases. Okay, so let's then move to what we are now talking about, the legislation that the Victorian government is likely to introduce into Parliament before the end of the year. And I should say, I don't know the details of this legislation. I'm not privy to it. I don't know whether it's even been decided. But it seems from the discussions that the legislation is likely to be similar to that which was passed as a result of a citizens' initiative in the state of Oregon in 1997. So we have 20 years of experience of this legislation in Oregon. The neighbouring state to Oregon, the state of Washington, observing what was happening in Oregon 8 years ago, so after observing it for 12 years, passed very similar legislation. So we have 8 years' experience in Washington. And since then, it's been spreading. So it is now legal as well as in those states, in Montana, in Vermont, in Colorado, and in the state of California, as well as most recently in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. So the legislation essentially there says that if a patient requests, a patient who is regarded as terminally ill by two doctors, and terminally ill as they're defined as likely to die within 6 months, if that patient asks the doctor for a prescription for a drug that he can take so that he or she can die peacefully, then there are a series of steps to be followed, which include a cooling off period. So a first initial request must be made in writing, then there must be a cooling off period, there must be a repetition of that request some days later. A second doctor must be consulted, as I say, to confirm the diagnosis that the patient is likely to die within 6 months. And then, after a further period, the prescription can be written, a pharmacist can fill it, and the patient can themselves take the substance and die. So, as I say, we've had 20 years' experience of this. The legislation is being used every year, but not in very large numbers. In 2016, 133 people used the legislation. Oregon has a population of about 4 million, so Victoria is around 6 million. You can add 50% to that, and maybe that's some indication. I don't know. Maybe we get a somewhat higher rate in Victoria. But it's not a very large proportion of all deaths. Another significant factor is that about a third of the people who get the prescription filled do not use it. They have it sitting there as reassurance that if things get bad, they have a way out. But they don't need to use it, they die a natural death, things don't get so bad. But still, it's been a comfort to them, and that's a good thing in itself. The other thing that we know from the statistics in Oregon, you may sometimes hear it said that if we pass such legislation, it will be the poor and the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, the less well-educated who are going to be pressed to use it so that they don't become a burden on the state. The statistics in Oregon and the very recent statistics for the first 6 months of the operation of the law in California show that that is the very opposite of the truth. In both California and Oregon, the legislation has been overwhelmingly used by whites, disproportionately few blacks in terms of their numbers in the population. Blacks and Hispanics, disproportionately few, use the legislation. Significantly more people using the legislation have university degrees than the average in the population. And significantly more have health insurance. Virtually all the people using it in Oregon, over 99%, have health insurance. And as you may know, not everybody in the United States, even under the legislation that Trump is trying to get repealed, not everybody has health insurance. So it doesn't seem to be true that it's the vulnerable or disadvantaged who are disproportionately using it. Rather, it seems to be the opposite that is the case. When I first started looking at this question of whether we should legislate for voluntary euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, a somewhat more extreme version of the slippery slope argument was put up. It was even said that it was the euthanasia of the so-called feeble-minded in Nazi Germany that led to the Holocaust, and that if we legalised euthanasia, we would start sliding down this slippery slope towards some much greater doing away of the unwanted, whether they were unwanted on racial or ethnic grounds or on economic grounds or on political grounds, that we would get such a slippery slope. You can look at the literature. Those arguments were being made. But it's very clear that nothing like that is happening. Nobody is even suggesting that anything like that is happening, neither in the jurisdictions in the United States that I just mentioned. And I should add, by the way, that Canada has also legislation for physician-assisted suicide, again, relatively recently. Neither in those jurisdictions is there any suggestion that anything like that is happening, nor in those countries in Europe that allow voluntary euthanasia. That is, instead of requiring that the patient take a drug themselves, in the situation that applies in the Netherlands, in Belgium and in Luxembourg, the doctor is allowed to give the patient lethal injection, again, on request. Nobody, we've had a lot, even more years of experience in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, goes right back to the 1970s or early 1980s, that it's been possible for doctors to openly, and with the support of the Royal Dutch Medical Association, give patients, under certain conditions, lethal injections. And yet clearly there's no slippery slope down towards Nazism or anything like that in the Netherlands, or in Belgium and Luxembourg. And again, it's significant that those are neighbouring countries that watched for some years what was happening in the Netherlands. In Belgium, the majority of people even speak Dutch, so they can watch Dutch television or read Dutch newspapers. They're better informed than any other nation in the world about what's going on in the Netherlands. And yet they decided that they wanted this themselves. It's also significant that in none of these jurisdictions has the body that passed the legislature, actually repealed it, or even has there been a serious political move by a major political party for repeal. I say by that legislature because, of course, it's true that briefly we had voluntary euthanasia in the Northern Territory, and that was overruled by the federal government at the instance of the Conservative politician Kevin Andrews, who persuaded the government under Howard, when the Conservatives had a majority in Parliament, to repeal it. But the Northern Territory did not seek to repeal it, and none of these places have. Even when in the Netherlands, Christian Democrats were the largest single party and there was a Roman Catholic Prime Minister, that Prime Minister did not attempt to repeal the legislation because he knew that the legislation was popular with the people of the Netherlands, was accepted by it, and that there was no major political parties supporting it. So this argument simply is not true, and I'm making that point forcefully today because I know that Professor Somerville is likely to argue that this is not just an individual choice. This is not just a choice that we should all make, it's a choice that has ramifications for society as a whole. Some of you may be fans of the TV program Q&A. If so, you might remember that a couple of months ago, Professor Somerville was on that panel, and there was an elderly couple in the audience who said that they wanted euthanasia legalised, or physician-assisted dying legalised, because once they got to the stage where they could no longer care for themselves, they didn't want to go into an old age home, they didn't want to just slowly decline and fade away, they wanted to have control of their own life, and they wanted to end it at that point. And Professor Somerville said, well, that is going to have consequences for others in society in terms of changing attitudes. And you may remember that the rather feisty elderly woman said in a pithy and direct manner, bullshit. That's a very blunt way of putting a philosophical point. I'm not going to quite use that language, but I do think that, in fact, when we look at the evidence in a dispassionate way, in a way without preconceived notions, we see that these now many jurisdictions that have legalised either voluntary euthanasia or physician-assisted dying do not really have signs of a pernicious slippery slope. They do have discussions going on, the Netherlands has discussions going on, about people like that couple that I just mentioned, for example. Should people who are really elderly and just say they're tired of life, they don't think their quality of life is good enough, that's it, should they have the option of ending their life? That's a reasonable question to ask, I think. It's not what we're talking about legislating for in Victoria. As I understand it, we're talking about legislating possibly for patients who are terminally ill, as in Oregon, possibly for patients who are suffering from an incurable condition for which there's no medical treatment, which they regard as unbearable. But I think we're not talking about people at end of life. But if in a few years we do get to that point, I think that's a discussion we can have, and I don't know how we would decide it. But I don't regard that as the kind of slippery slope that ought to deter you from thinking that this is a good thing, this is something that we want to happen, and this is something which, when we look at the way many people who we know have died, this is something that they would have wanted. I think it's significant that one of the reasons why Victoria's Premier, Daniel Andrews, is now a supporter of this legislation is that he watched his father die, and he did not think that that was a good thing, and he thinks his father's death could have been improved if legislation like this existed. And if somebody is well connected and well educated, as Daniel Andrews can say that, then clearly that is going to be true still, despite all the excellent medical care we get, of a significant number of people in Victoria, and I think we ought to be able to help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Singer. It's now time to introduce our second speaker this evening, somebody whose career as a public intellectual is, I think, probably more widely recognised abroad than it is necessarily in Australia. Margaret Somerville is currently Professor of Bioethics at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, having returned to the bosom of her family and country only a short time ago from very many years in Canada, particularly at McGill University in Montreal. Margaret was born in Adelaide, did law at the University of Sydney, where she was the university medalist for her year. In November 2006, she was honoured in Canada with the invitation to present that country's Massey Lectures, and that's the equivalent of, say, the Reith Lectures of the BBC in the UK, or here our own Boyer Lectures on the ABC. And an expanded version of those lectures was published in Canada, Australia and the United States in book form as The Ethical Imagination, Journeys of the Human Spirit. Would you welcome Margaret Somerville both to home and tonight?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank Gordon for the invitation and for organising this event. Well, Professor Singer is right about one point, and that is that I will disagree with him on almost every point. The euthanasia-assisted suicide debate is not about if we will die. We all will. It's about how we die and what limits should be placed on how we die. And it involves a conflict between respect for individual autonomy, which is the value that Professor Singer's given priority to, and the value of respect for human life. I'm going to use the word euthanasia to include assisted suicide, doctor-assisted suicide, and euthanasia, which is giving lethal injections. I want to point out that withdrawal of treatment or refusal of treatment or giving adequate pain management, none of those are euthanasia. And there's a lot of confusion, even in the medical profession, about what is and isn't euthanasia, and certainly in the general public. But they are not euthanasia. The easiest way to talk about euthanasia is to talk about, do we believe that it's okay for a doctor to give a lethal injection to somebody with the intention of killing that person with the lethal injection? Now, pro-euthanasia people argue that that's just another medical treatment. It's just an extension of palliative care. Anti-euthanasia people disagree with that. They argue that it's not medical treatment. It never has been. We have a 2,500-year history of the Hippocratic Oath saying we will cure where possible, care always, never kill. It's not a medical treatment. And in fact, a very large percentage of doctors don't regard it as a medical treatment either. And if we legalised it, it would be a radical change in both our foundational societal values, that we don't kill innocent people, and in medicine, that medicine doesn't carry that out on our behalf. Many people from the pro-euthanasia movement, and Professor Singh has mentioned this to you, they argue that euthanasia concerns only the individual. I disagree with that. I think that it raises wide-ranging major issues for medicine and law, for the practitioners of those professions, and indeed of all the healthcare professions, and for all of us as families, communities, and as societies. Pro-euthanasia people deny, and you've just heard Professor Singer do this, that there are any slippery slopes. And again, I think that that is wrong, that once euthanasia is legalised, slippery slopes are unavoidable, because the same arguments that justify euthanasia in the first place justify the opening up of the slippery slopes. And there's two kinds of slippery slope. The logical slippery slope, that is, the people who can have access to euthanasia are increased, and the practical slippery slope, which is even when it is legalised, people do it not in accordance with the law. In one study that was done in Belgium by colleagues of mine in Canada, they sent a survey to doctors in the Flanders region of Belgium and asked them if they'd ever carried out euthanasia. And of those that had, they resurveyed them and said, had they ever done it not in accordance with the law? 32% of the doctors said they had done it not in accordance with the law. That's a huge number. So in other words, even when you have a law, the law is not obeyed. Now what I want to do tonight is, because it was really hard to decide what to talk to you about. I mean, there's about 1,000 things that you could talk about in this area. But what I decided to do, because these have just come to my attention, is to tell you about two very recent striking examples of the logical slippery slope, that is the expansion of euthanasia to more people. And one is in the Netherlands, one is in my home province, my ex-home province of Quebec. And I hope that these will make those who deny slippery slopes think again. So first of all, the Netherlands. The psychiatrist, Dr. Boudjen Chabot, is a very prominent pro-euthanasia advocate in the Netherlands. In fact, he's been called the patron saint of euthanasia, and he's recently, very recently, written an article in which he says he's horrified by what is happening in his country. This man actually euthanized a woman who was not physically ill. This was in the 1990s. She was severely depressed, and he thought she should be given euthanasia. And he then, after he did the euthanasia, he went to the police and said, I have just given a lethal injection to this woman. He was taken to court. He was found to be guilty but given no penalty at all, just released. And so he was one of the people that opened up euthanasia for mentally ill people in the Netherlands. But writing in a Dutch newspaper about 2 weeks ago, Dr. Chabot says, and I quote, that legal safeguards for euthanasia are slowly eroding away, and the law no longer protects people with psychiatric conditions and dementia. He said he's not anti-euthanasia. He's prepared to accept tens of thousands of euthanasia cases, but he said he was aghast at the rapid rise in the number of people with psychiatric illness or dementia who've been euthanized. He recognises, and I quote, we're dealing with a morally problematic act. How do you kill somebody who does not understand that he will be killed? And he concludes bitterly, I don't see how we can get the genie back in the bottle. It would already mean a lot if we'd acknowledge he's out. We need to think of this in relation to vulnerable Australians, those who are elderly and fragile, especially those with dementia, people with disabilities, including newborn babies, who can also be euthanized in the Netherlands. And in both the Netherlands and Belgium, euthanasia has now been extended to children. The Australian Law Reform Commission has just warned that 4 to 14% of elderly Australians are abused. Financial abuse takes the form of what the Commission calls early inheritance syndrome. The old person lets another person, often their child, handle their financial assets, and they use those assets for themselves. Imagine early inheritance syndrome combined with early death syndrome. Governments will also have a conflict of interest. Since euthanasia has been legalised in Canada, which was just last June, some Canadian healthcare economists have calculated that euthanasia could save Medicare, that's the socialised healthcare system in Canada, $138 million a year. The government might find that very tempting. American healthcare insurance companies are refusing to pay for life-extending drugs, but they will pay for physician-assisted suicide because, I quote, they write letters to people saying it's available at a reasonable cost and recommending that that's the path that they take. So that's just a tiny bit of the Netherlands, a tiny, tiny bit. There's a lot more, and if you wanted it, Dr. Chabot's letter is published in a newspaper, or that was in Dutch, but there is a translation. It's extremely interesting. So now to turn to where I've lived for the last 40 years and been intensely involved in this debate. And there's an extreme example of a logical slippery slope just unfolding there. Dr. Yves Robert, who's the Registrar of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Quebec, that's the medical licensing authority, was a main instigator of the movement to legalise euthanasia. As I'm here on this platform with Professor Singer tonight, I was often on a platform with Dr. Robert. And I can tell you what he thought. He routinely rejected claims that effective safeguards could not be put in place to regulate it. He also rejected arguments that euthanasia was not a medical act and that if legalised it must be kept out of medicine. I had proposed that if society wants it, at least let's keep it out of medicine. Let's have a special group of people who are trained to give lethal injections, and I would suggest we call them thanatologists, so we can have a new profession. Dr. Robert said, no, it was a medical act and it was appropriate for doctors. He regarded it, and he was very genuine, he regarded it as good palliative care, appropriate for doctors to provide. His constant reference was to a continuum of good end-of-life care, which included euthanasia. Indeed, that's what they wrote into the Act, enabling this to be done. As in the Australian debate, pro-euthanasia advocates claimed it would be rarely used, and the Minister of Health in Quebec, who was a medical specialist, said he thought there would never be more than 100 cases a year. The first year's figures show 400 cases in Quebec, and he expressed great surprise when told that, and there's been almost 1,500 cases in Canada as a whole already. In the first 7 months of the Quebec law, 262 cases, 21 or 14% of which did not meet the legal requirements, and this is just a new law. In 2, the patient was not terminally ill, as is required by the law, and in 1, they now think that all she had was a urinary infection. But none of this seemed to raise any questions for the college, or I assume for Dr. Robert, about whether legalising euthanasia had been a good idea. Here's what has made him change his mind. There are now calls, and possibly, and this is just in the last week or so, there are now calls and possibly the launching of a court case to have, quote, death on demand declared a constitutional right. We're big on constitutional rights in Canada. That's the way you get things. The argument is that no one else has got the right to tell me what I should do with my life or body, and if I want to be dead rather than alive, then that's my right, and having to fulfil certain conditions to have access to euthanasia is a breach of my right to be dead and legally actionable discrimination. And it's a reversal of the usual discrimination, because what the people are saying is, if I was disabled, I could have it, and therefore you're discriminating against me because I'm not disabled. The claim of a right to death on demand is consistent with the arguments used to legalise euthanasia, namely that people have got a right to autonomy and self-determination concerning their own bodies and lives. This expansion is, however, where Dr. Robert, and I admire him for his integrity and courage in coming out against what he was the chief operator in instituting, he's now parting company with some of his fellow pro-euthanasia advocates. The letter that he's released, which is written under the college heading, so it's an official letter, has the title Death à la carte. That is, how one wants to die can now be chosen from a menu of options, just as you would go to a restaurant and choose your dinner. He first notes in this letter that opinion leaders and the media have denounced as cruel and discrimination cases where people who do not fulfil the conditions for access to euthanasia in Quebec have been refused it. Now, you can compare that with something in Dr. Chabot's article in the newspaper. He talks about the End of Life Clinic Foundation, which has been set up in the Netherlands, and that is a clinic that offers patients whose own doctors have refused them euthanasia, and they don't ever offer to treat the underlying illness, whether it's physical or mental. And the number of people going to that clinic who have got psychiatric illness has increased dramatically, and that's what upset Dr. Chabot. Dr. Robert, back to Quebec, Dr. Robert notes the paradoxical discourse that calls for safeguards to avoid abuse of what is called in Quebec medical aid in dying, another euphemism, which are meant to limit its availability while asking doctors to act as if there were no restrictions. He continues that if euthanasia is an unfettered right, then it's not within the scope of medical aid to die, but is simply assisted dying, and he says the society must consider other options than involving the medical profession in that. That's because, he says, it is to transform medical aid in dying, i.e. euthanasia, to legally authorised aid in dying, a form of assisted suicide, or you could say a form of homicide, he says could be provided by private enterprise, as in Switzerland. Taking the white coat off euthanasia makes a big difference for how everyone sees it. And I think we have to look at it outside medicine to judge what it really is. By wrapping euthanasia in the cloak, especially the cloak of palliative care, we're mistaken as to the nature of what we're doing. Dr. Robert goes on to note that the law was une ouverture majeure, a major opening to euthanasia, and expresses surprise at how quickly public opinion seems to have judged the opening insufficient. And he says, even when testing the law is still in, and I'm quoting here, the apprenticeship phase, and the application and consequences of its provisions are not fully assimilated. In short, euthanasia has become normalised in Quebec with astonishing rapidity, less than a year, and that has caused calls for access to it to be expanded, indeed calls to have no restrictions on access at all. And I can assure you that Quebec is a very civilised society. So this is not some rogue, country going off the rails. Dr. Robert concludes, and I'll translate what he says, "Let us take the time to reflect deeply before going any further. There is no urgency to die." I totally agree, but to use a common saying, it's too late to lock the barn door after the horse has bolted. As for me, after being heavily involved in the euthanasia debate over many years in Quebec, to use another common saying, you could have knocked me down with a feather when I read what Dr. Robert had said. This example shows, as British moral philosopher Dame Mary Warnock has put it, you cannot successfully block a slippery slope except by a fixed and invariable obstacle. In the case of euthanasia, that obstacle is the rule that we must not intentionally kill, and because they have much more opportunity to do so than most of us, in particular that healthcare professionals must not intentionally kill. And recall Dr. Chabot's lament, "I don't see how we can get the genie back in the bottle. It would already mean a lot if we acknowledge that he's out." So why did so many doctors and lawyers of goodwill and professional integrity, such as Dr. Robert, so adamantly deny that such expansions could occur, although none of us expected an expansion to this degree? I believe it was a total failure of individual and professional collective memory and collective imagination. A failure to look back to the past and take into account the cautionary tales and analogues human memory, history provides, and a failure to look to the future through imagination and ask ourselves, how do we not want our great-great-grandchildren to die, and to ask ourselves, what kind of a world will we have left to them? It's a result of a combination of intense individualism and unadulterated presentism. And Professor Singer's presentation was intense individualism. That was the informing principle, and it's actually unadulterated presentism because you look just to that person at this moment. And important as that is, and we must always do it, we've also got to think about the wider ripples that euthanasia opens up. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. And Professor Singer was right. I'm going to say to you, this does concern other people. It concerns families, communities, societies, and even globally. There's been a concerted effort by pro-euthanasia advocates to use strategies and arguments that inhibit us from looking back and looking forward. Euthanasia has been sanitised and euphemised through massaging the language used to refer to it. Voluntary assisted dying, not suicide, let alone killing. They argue it's entirely different from suicide in any other context. That's not true. It's still suicide, and it still gives a message that suicide is an appropriate response to suffering. They argue it's another end-of-life medical treatment, no different from any other treatment we already accept. They argue it's part of good palliative care. As I said, they wrap it in a medical cloak. They argue that, and this is very common here in Victoria, I've encountered it a couple of times already and got into a lot of trouble for making protests, that legalising it is inevitable because a strong majority of the general population want it. And they argue that effective safeguards and regulations will ensure it won't be abused or expanded. And they argue, as Professor Singer did, that it's happening anyway, which I would dispute with him. I believe that history will look back in the future and recognise that what we decide about legalising euthanasia was the most important collective decision of the early decades of the 21st century and possibly of the entire century. Legalising it would be a seismic shift in our shared foundational societal values. It's not an incremental change, it's a revolution, not an evolution. It's a shift in shared foundational values in the institutions of medicine and law and in our communities, families and individual lives. Let's not go there. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. There's room for vigorous disagreement, I see. What a wonderful way to warm up on a freezing cold winter's night. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and while I'm asking a couple of questions, we'll have a little interchange here. Please feel free to get on your iPhones or whatever other device you have to tap through your questions to RASP. Let me just remind you what that is, rasp@divinity, divinity.edu.au, and if you get those questions through, then they can be passed up to me. One of the first questions that seems to me that needs to be discussed here is just what are we talking about? What are we talking about here? Let's frame it even more closely. What do we think the way in which the Victorian government has defined this, voluntary assisted dying, means? Is that intentional, and what is the intention behind that? Perhaps, Peter, you first.
Yes, certainly. I think that's a good question to ask. So I think it's clear that the Victorian government is not talking about enabling doctors to give lethal injections, as in the Netherlands, for example. I think it is talking about something like the Oregon system. But yes, this is intentional, undoubtedly. We're talking about a patient who requests of a doctor a prescription that will bring about a peaceful death. Clearly has to repeat that request some days later, as I said. So, you know, not just a present intention, but an enduring intention. And the doctor has to know or will understand that this is what the patient is wanting. So the intention is certainly there. And whether this will apply only to patients who are terminally ill or to patients who are incurably ill, I think that's something that we don't know about at this stage.
Margaret, is there a reason for the wording of this legislation as you see it? Or proposed legislation, I should say.
I would just add, though, and Peter's right that we don't know exactly what the legislation will be, but there is a draft out, and in the draft it does anticipate that there would be euthanasia as well as assisted suicide.
That's not a draft. As far as I know, that's not a draft bill. There is no draft bill out. There is a discussion paper in which various proposals have been outlined, and as you know, I don't think there is any commitment, and I will be extremely surprised if the Victorian government introduces legislation that would allow doctors to give lethal injections, because that's not how I read the tone of the discussion at all.
Peter, I must admit I can't tell you exactly what the status of this document. You're right, there's no actual legislation at the moment, but there is a sort of a pro forma bill, and in that it says that it's assisted suicide, but this is where the euthanasia comes in, but if the person is unable to take the medication themselves, and it doesn't say medication, the word that's used is substance, then the doctor may administer the substance, which would actually cover euthanasia. And what did you ask me, John?
Well, just if you think the
The
phrasing
language.
of the...
Yeah, well, the language, yes, because the pro-euthanasia, I know for Canada, and I guess it's probably the same here, but what was found, that if you did a survey of the general public and you asked them did they agree with euthanasia or assisted suicide, you got fairly low figures of people agreeing with it. If you asked them if they agreed with physician-assisted death or medical aid in dying, which are the terms that are used in the Canadian legislation, a very large number of the people who disagreed with euthanasia and assisted suicide agreed with medical aid in dying. After all, we all want medical aid when we're dying. And so it's and even when I was on Q&A the other night, as Peter mentioned to you, the Minister for Communications, admittedly he's not the Minister for Bioethics, but he described palliative care as more or less being euthanasia, and it just wasn't. What he described about his parents' death, and I think what John described about your parents' death, Peter seemed to think that might have been euthanasia, I understood from what he said, and I don't think it was euthanasia at all.
But surely, well, John can answer this, but surely if you would agree that if the intention of giving the morphine and those doses of morphine, if the intention was to end life, that is euthanasia, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is,
Right.
but John
So-
didn't say that there was any massive dose of morphine given or that you meant to end life.
No, I say there's a question hanging, and I think that was left hanging deliberately. I mean, I don't know the answer. That's why I posed the question.
So it might have been euthanasia as you define it as well, right? Then
If you have an intention to kill the person with what you're administering, that's euthanasia. But it's awfully hard to kill somebody with morphine. There's a lot of mythology around that, which is not right. One of my other early careers was as a pharmacist. So, and morphine is not the drug that's used to kill people.
Can I ask another question? Peter, and this goes somewhere towards the slippery slope argument, which seems to have occupied a deal of the discussion this evening. You write in other material that you've written about the sort of nature of human self-interest and the way in which we sometimes underestimate the way in which self-interest prevails. To what extent does the argument about human self-interest, the desire to protect oneself, intrude into this argument in the way which you've stated it in relation to other topics that you've raised over the years?
well, clearly, I mean, it is self-interest, reasonable self-interest, I think, for somebody not to want to suffer and not to want to continue to live if they believe that their quality of life has fallen to a point where it is mostly suffering or mostly something that they perceive as negative. So that's self-interest, but I would distinguish that from other places where I've written about self-interest. For example, Margaret just mentioned things that, decisions of the 21st century that history will blame us for. I think the big one is our selfishness in continuing to use fossil fuels, despite what we know this is very likely to do to the planet for centuries to come. So that's selfish because we're doing something which we may enjoy, or it's cheaper for us to get to places using fossil fuels, but at the expense of other people.
So you'd be arguing, as you write in other places, that altruism and selfishness are balanced in the individual, and the individual has to be able to make choices between both, and generally we've heard, because civilisation survives, on the side of altruism. That is, the the good-natured side of it prevails? I know I risk generalising.
Yeah,
to the point
that
of
is a
absurdity,
generalisation that I'd be hesitant to make. What I'm saying, I do think that we have capacities for altruism and that they've been tremendously important. But, you know, certainly there's a great deal of self-interest. My concern is with self-interest, as I say, where we're doing something which is clearly harming others more than it's benefiting us. And that's what I think is not the case in the situations we're talking about.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that's a problem when we talk about suffering is that with the decline in adherence to religion, it's very difficult to give any meaning to suffering, and therefore you think, well, there's no value or any worth in it, and so you just want to get out of it. You know, Viktor Frankl said that if you can give people a why to live, they'll find a how to live, no matter how appalling the conditions they're in. And so there's a new book out called Dignity Therapy by an excellent psychiatrist, Canadian, called Dr. Harvey Max Chochinov. And he's a psychiatrist who specialises in psychiatry of terminally ill and dying people. And it's a marvellous book. I've just written a review of it. And what you can see in that, in the stories that are recounted in that even people who've asked for euthanasia, when they are given a why to live, and that's what they were trying to do with this psychotherapeutic intervention, they can find a how to live. And there's some of the story, I mean, I don't want to romanticise suffering or romanticise dying and death. It's all horrible. But there's things that can be found in it, and people say things like, you know, I really wouldn't have wanted to have missed this time in my life. And so we are at fault in a way that we're not helping people enough. And one of the problems is going to be that costs money, and our healthcare systems are stretched, and so it's going to be cheap. It's like Jeff Kennett, that's somebody I think you Melburnians who will know who he is. I usually have to explain who he is. But he once said, when the legislation was in the Northern Territory, that as far as I'm concerned, when you're past your best buy or used before date, you should be checked out as quickly, cheaply and efficiently as possible. And my response to him was that we're not products in a supermarket to be checked out of life. And so, you know, we really have to be careful here.
I'll agree with you on your opposition to Jeff Kennett and to that statement.
Thank you, Peter.
But there is a substantial argument there that has a deal of public support behind it. That is, what Jeff Kennett said tended to reduce individuals to basically utilities, consumer utilities, and that's a pretty powerful argument when it's raised by a populist politician, in the sense that Jeff was using it.
Yes, but I mean, I think we do have a strong sense of respect for people's choices. You know, Margaret said that was my overriding individualist value. I don't think I'm that individualist. As I said, you know, there are many collective problems like climate change that we can't be individualist on. But I do think that we have enough of that respect for people's choices to not want to regard them as you know, commodities that need to be checked out, that we do want to support them, and we have healthcare systems that do support people and allow them to make those choices. But at the same time, if their choices are the other way, that, you know, and I also would agree with you, Margaret, that if they get meaning in continuing to exist, then that's great, and I'm all for psychiatrists or counsellors or whatever to try and encourage people to find ways to get meaning in whatever life they have lived. That's fine. But I don't want to impose on them the idea that, look, you've got to find meaning. There is meaning. You can't die because, you know, I know there's meaning even if you don't see it. I think at that point, I do want to let them make the choice.
Peter, you know, if it just concerned the individual, I would agree with you. But I think that how we die affects all of us and affects our societies and our communities and our families. In fact, the figures on psychiatric illness, both in doctors who carry out euthanasia, the latest thing I've seen is that about 20% of doctors who carry out euthanasia actually get post-traumatic stress disorder, and the Dutch Medical Society is really quite concerned about this. In Canada, they decided to compose a list of doctors who would be willing to carry out euthanasia, and the doctors had to put their names forward. The government didn't make them go on the list. Anyway, quite a few of those doctors have since dropped off the list after carrying out one case of euthanasia. They said it was immensely traumatic for them and they couldn't do it again. And as well, family members who attend when somebody is euthanized, it's similar percentage of them, around about 20% of them also have mental health problems after being at that event. So it's not all just easy either, even if you have it.
Yeah, I think it's not easy to control for those factors, you know, to really do a comparative study. But look, I certainly think doctors should have those choices, and I don't. It's one thing I didn't say, that I think the Victorian legislation will allow doctors who have conscientious objections to assisting people in dying to withdraw from that.
But they're going to require, according to this wrong pro forma thing that I've got.
Discussion paper. Yeah.
That in it I know, because they put this in Canada, and there's now a case going to the Supreme Court of Canada, because the legislation requires what's called effective referral. And that means that if you are a conscientious objector, you have to send the person to somebody you know will carry it out. And you've already got an effective referral provision here in the Abortion Act in Victoria, that a doctor who's not willing to do abortion has got a legal obligation to send the person, and that's what's called complicity. And I'm not a philosopher, but as far as I know, complicity carries the same moral weight as doing it yourself.
Well, I think the thing is, if you do have a conscientious objection, it would be wrong to say that you're not doing the abortion or you're not assisting in dying because you don't think it's medically indicated, for example, or it's not possible for some reason. So I think you do have to make the patient realise that your objections to this are not medical but moral, and that's a pretty short step from the patient then saying, well, is there another doctor who would do it? And obviously, you know, the answer is yes, or, you know, even if the doctor just has to say, well, you can go on this website and look, that would be enough, I think.
Peter, let me ask another question that's related to Margaret's observation about the philosophical issues here. There have been other eminent philosophers who, whilst they admire the clarity of the logic that you imply, they would question, I mentioned, say, Roger Scruton is probably the outstanding, well-known example, that your starting point is not where they would start. They go back to the sorts of things that Margaret's saying about the humans being essentially a social animal. We derive our stuff not principally from individual rights, but from a sense of who we are in community. How do you respond to those?
Oh, I don't deny that we're social animals, but I don't think that that resolves this question one way or another. Indeed, you know, when you look at the way physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide, if you prefer that term, is carried out, say, in Oregon, and has been for many years, it is typically the family and friends who will gather around and say their farewells to the person who has got the prescription and has decided that the time has come. And that is a social act, and I know that for many families it's a matter of, if you like, a moving moment that they can be there at that time, and better than the deaths that might otherwise occur where somebody slips away into states of delirium and can't really say farewells at the moment and can't control anything that is going on for the last few days. So I don't think the idea that we're social animals is at all any way of settling the issue one way or the other.
Yeah, there's concern though about the Oregon legislation, because the person gets the drugs. There's no requirement for the doctor to be present when they take the drugs. And one of the concerns is, how do you know that nobody coerced them into taking it? How do you know that no one else assisted them? They're supposed to be able to do it themselves. So, and also the rate, although the numbers are not big, the rate of increase of use of the Oregon legislation is not, I mean, it's not major numbers, but it is increasing. And as well, and I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, Peter, they've introduced a bill into the, it's a private member's bill, into the Oregon legislature to extend the Act to allow euthanasia, lethal injections. Now, of course, it's an open question whether it'll pass.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a discussion that they can have, but as I say, you know, there isn't a move to change the legislation, to get rid of the legislation, I should say, to go back to what it was before the legislation was passed.
Also, you listed off all the US states that have got assisted suicide legislation. And the last count, I think, was 8 states have got it now, was California. But you've got to keep in mind there's 51 states in the United States, so it's a small percentage of all the states that have this.
Yes, it is, but with California, it's now 60 million Americans who are covered by the legislation, so it's about a fifth of Americans who are covered. And my prediction would be that, give another 10 years, it'll be closer to half.
It's time to take your questions, and I've received some, and I've got them on a carefully put together notepad here. The first question is, and I'll use people's first names, not their surnames. The first one is from Brad, and it's a question for Professor Peter Singer. Brad says, my father, who specifically chose not to have a not for resuscitation NFR order placed on his medical file and made myself a medical power of attorney, should he be incompetent to make his own medical decisions, suffered a bilateral thalamic stroke and was a patient on a neurology stroke ward at Box Hill Hospital, had an NFR order placed on his medical record by the treating doctor without my father's consent and against his express wishes, also against my power of enduring medical attorney, because he believed this was in my father's best interests. Could we see situations where euthanasia medical decisions are being made against patients' express consent begin to become a standard practice where the treating doctor believes it's in the patient's best interests? What protections would there be against such misuse? Peter.
Well, I mean, you know, could we have that happening now, right? If in terms of the legislation that is being discussed, that would clearly be illegal. That would be a crime, as it is a crime now. That's not to say that it never happens now. In fact, as I mentioned, the survey that Helga Kuzer and I took some years ago suggested that it does happen now. I think there's a serious situation. I agree that it's deplorable. It's also deplorable, by the way, when I think somebody who does have an NFR order gets resuscitated nevertheless, and that happens too. But I don't think that one way or other the kind of legislation the Victorian government is envisaging is going to change that situation.
Margaret,
yeah, one of the things that Dr. Chabot talks about in his article, and there have been cases of this written up in the newspapers in England recently, is that the people who've got dementia and therefore they can't decide for themselves what they want, they've been surreptitiously putting sedatives, very strong sedatives, into their coffee, and these people then go to sleep, and then they euthanize them while they're unconscious from the sedatives, and he's appalled about that. And so this is the whole situation of doing medical things to people where you don't have the proper authority to do them, whether it's to give treatment or to withhold treatment.
We'll let that one hang and we'll move on to the next question. A question from Asher, and it's for Professor Margaret Somerville. How is removal of life support any different to assisted suicide?
Because with assisted suicide, you kill yourself using the means that the doctor gave you with the intention that you could use them to kill yourself. Withdrawal of life support is a medical decision that when the treatment is futile, medically futile, or too burdensome for the person, here I sound a bit like Peter, it's doing more harm than good, then you can withdraw that treatment. But you die a natural death. If you withdraw treatment and there's nothing wrong with you, you don't die. You die because you've got, for example, a failed respiratory system or a failed cardiac system or whatever it is. And so the difference is between killing somebody and allowing somebody to die a natural death. There is no legal or ethical problem with allowing people to die a natural death. But I mean, from my point of view, there's big problems in killing them or helping them to kill themselves, and that's euthanasia and assisted suicide.
Well, I have to disagree with that because if somebody is in an intensive care unit with all the equipment that you've got in an intensive care unit and you decide to withdraw that equipment and allow them to die a natural death, you're making a decision. You have made the judgment that it is better that that person die than that person continue to live, assuming you have the machines that will keep them going. So you are making a decision. You may choose not to call it a killing, but you are making a decision. And I think that is very close in terms of its moral seriousness to making a judgment that it's better that this person not die. And we should really take that a lot more seriously than we have. And I think the idea that somehow, oh, well then they die naturally, and therefore we don't really have to worry about it very seriously, is actually treating death too lightly a decision as to whether this person will continue to live or will not continue to live.
A question from Kate for Peter Singer. Given the experience of Holland's euthanasia laws, do you think Victoria's euthanasia laws will be extended to cover youth and young adults and those suffering mental illness, including clinical depression?
The only honest answer I can give to that is I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see the future. Look, I think that the discussions that have been had in the Netherlands are discussions on serious issues. They're not frivolous. They're not just a willy-nilly extension of a slippery slope. If you have known somebody with serious, prolonged depression that has not responded to treatment, if you've known somebody who's been in that state for, let's say, 20 years, and it's a really miserable condition to be in. And the idea that at some point, after all treatments have been tried and failed, that at some point that person might ask for assistance in dying, might ask for voluntary euthanasia, whatever you want to call it, and that should be given, doesn't seem to me to be a crazy or a decision that you would regard as a slippery slope to some horrible state that we would never want to get to. It's a difficult question because with mental illness, it's more difficult perhaps to know whether it could be cured at some point, whether the person has got the capacity to make the decision. Those questions can properly be raised. Similarly with infants and children. I've talked to the doctor in the Netherlands who's responsible for the protocol known as the Groningen Protocol, under which a very small number of very seriously affected infants with conditions that could not be treated and where the suffering could not be relieved have been given euthanasia. I think you could count the number of children on the fingers of your hands, and it actually hasn't gone up, it's gone down. The first report suggested there were 5 children in a certain number of years, and the second case there were only 2 children. That's probably because of better detection of these anomalies in utero, and so fewer children are being born. But it's not that is certainly not something that's spreading. But again, I think those are reasonable decisions to make in those circumstances. And again, we are making life or death decisions for severely affected newborns in this city right now. When I was involved in the Centre for Human Bioethics at Monash, we had doctors come to us from the Royal Children's and from the Queen Vic, from their neonatal intensive care units, telling us that they were making decisions to withdraw treatment from infants with serious conditions because they thought that was in the best interests of the infants. So, these were intentional life-ending decisions. So, by your definition, Margot, they should have been regarded as euthanasia. So, those are real questions, and I can't predict how we'll go in a few years.
Yeah, what Peter's answer tells you is that he and I have different starting points. Peter's starting point is this going to do more good than harm? Will it relieve suffering? And does the relief of suffering outweigh any qualms we might have about what we're doing? My starting point is it inherently wrong to intentionally kill another human being, the sole exception being where it's the only reasonable way to save innocent human life? And self-defence is the best example of that. And so once I say, yes, it is inherently wrong, which is what I really believe, then you don't get into the sort of stuff Peter's talking about. And if any of you want to see sort of a filmed example of a 34-year-old Dutch woman who's got serious depression but no physical illness, being euthanized by the doctor, it's a film called End Credits. When I saw it, I was asked to look at it, to speak at a film festival, and I saw it and I thought, oh, this is an incredible film. Everybody will freak out and say, no, we will never have euthanasia. And so I went back to the people and said, okay, yes, I'll come because it's such an anti-euthanasia film. And they were shocked and horrified. It had been made by the Dutch Right to Die Society, and they thought it was a pro-euthanasia film because it was relieving this woman's suffering. So we have just such different perceptions of what we're involved in doing here. And I think we've got to be conscious of that in order to understand the arguments on each side.
Margaret, you were asked on that Q&A program, which has been referred to, whether the basis of your ethical foundations had come from a religious perspective, from a Christian perspective. And you said, no, I am drawing this out of my understanding of the philosophical basis. Do you just want to articulate that a little more clearly? Just the basis on which you are drawing that?
I have a religion. I don't know whether I'd say I'm religious, but I have a religion and I was brought up a Catholic, so, that necessarily influences you. But I very deeply believe it's wrong. I even have qualms about euthanizing animals, and I know that Peter will disagree seriously with me about that. But I believe it's inherently wrong to intentionally kill another person. And I also believe that we can't afford to breach that, because if we do, and I think this is what we're seeing in the countries that have legalised euthanasia, then you can't control it. It's a false hope that you can control this. You can't. Once you step over the line that says you must not kill, then there's no obvious limit to where and when you will kill. That's the problem. And so that's why I oppose it.
A question to Margaret again from Rachel. People often refer to euthanasia as dying with dignity. Margaret, you asked the question in one of your books. How would you define dignity and what is required to respect it? I would be curious to hear both Peter and your thoughts on this. Rachel.
Well, I know that we've got different definitions, or I would.
Why don't you go first?
Well, there's two ways of looking at dignity. What you can call intrinsic, that is, you have dignity simply because you're a member of the human race. You're a human being, and it doesn't matter what you can or can't do. Your dignity is not dependent on being a human doing, and also it's not dependent on someone else attributing dignity to you. It's inherent to you. I think I know that Peter's definition is an extrinsic definition, that you only have dignity if you've got certain characteristics, which in a sense you only have dignity if you're a human doing, that you can do those things that bring the protection of dignity with them.
Well, I'm not quite going to say that, but firstly I'm going to object to the idea that you get dignity just by being, as you just said, a member of the human race. That is, a really classic statement of what I would call speciesism. You belong to a certain species, you have dignity. You belong to a different species, you may not have dignity. And I can't see how just being a member of a particular species in itself is going to give you dignity. That does seem to me to be very like a religious perspective. The idea that you've got an immortal soul because all humans have immortal souls, some religions teach, and non-humans don't have immortal souls. Or the idea that you're made in the image of God, and gorillas and elephants and dolphins are not made in the image of God. That does look to me like something that has come from that kind of tradition. Whereas I would say, our dignity is a matter of how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves among others in the world. And so we may feel that we have dignity as long as we have some control over the way we're living and our choices. And we lose that dignity perhaps when we become helpless and passive, and we feel that we are no longer capable of exercising the things that we value. So I think to a significant extent for me, it's an internal perspective on our values and our choices.
A question from Paul to Peter. I'm not being apostolic here. Peter, how are you going to protect patients who want to die naturally from authorities who see the patient's failing life as pointless and simply wish to hasten their death?
Well, we're going to protect them in the way that we protect them now. The legislation that is proposed will give patients choices, but it won't compel patients to do anything. And that's, I think, its great merit, and particularly as we are living in a pluralist society, and we just saw from the census that 30% of Australians now have no religion, and in fact, people with no religion now outnumber people who say that they're Catholics. So in that society, I don't think we should be saying that because some people have a view that it is inherently wrong to kill another human being, as Margot just said, that they ought to impose that view on others who don't have that view and don't have that religious background, but perhaps some of the others do, rather than saying, okay, so you live according to your beliefs and your views, and therefore you take advantage of this legislation, and you don't have that view and you want to go on living and die a natural death. And of course, we will respect you in doing that, and we will make sure that we have the medical system that enables you to do that in comfort. I quite agree that people need medical attention when they're dying, and that's, in that sense, medical assistance in dying is too broad a term, and we can give people that medical assistance in dying, even if they want to die a natural death.
But you see, that question relates just to an individual and who's dying in the present. But you've got to ask, what difference does it make to society, to our values, that we say we will kill people? And that's what we're going to be doing.
Well, we're saying we will allow people to request assistance in dying.
But someone's going to do it.
Yes, and we will allow people who choose to offer that assistance to give it.
In a secular society, which is what Australia is, which doesn't mean that nobody has religion, it just means that there's no religion of the society itself, the two main institutions that carry the value of respect for human life are the law, which says you must not kill, and medicine that says we will never kill. Now we're going to change that. The law will be changed to say, well, sometimes you can kill somebody else, and we're going to have medicine doing it. So that affects everybody. It's not just this two solitudes that you talk of, that one group can say, I want to be killed, and the other one can say, I don't. We will have changed the whole ethos of medicine and the ethos of our society. Also, the value of respect for human life. I would beg you not to use the term sanctity of life, because then it does sound as though it's only for religious people. It's the issue of maintaining respect for human life in society as a whole. And that has to be maintained with respect to every individual and in the tone of society itself. At the societal level, you've got to have respect for human life. And you test that by how we treat our weakest, most in need, most vulnerable people. And all dying people fall in that category.
Peter, can I just ask an elaboration of that? Are you saying that the changes are such, well, Margot is suggesting that the changes are such as they will shift the foundations on which we build our understanding of humans in society?
Yeah,
are you saying that under these definitions, no, we can confine that, or that you don't accept the proposition that Margot is making?
Well, the proposition that she stated, that it's inherently wrong to take innocent human life, I don't accept. And Margot was saying that this is a universally true, whereas I would say it's not inherently wrong when the person has chosen, carefully chosen, and competent person, to ask for assistance in dying. So I think we can distinguish that. I think we can have a better understanding. Well, the reason I went into that question about what's wrong with killing at the beginning is because I think it's important for us to have a good understanding of what is wrong with killing. And I don't think the understanding that it's always inherently wrong, even if you choose to ask for somebody to kill you, I don't think that is the best understanding. I think the best understanding is, as I said, that it's inherently wrong to kill somebody who wants to go on living, or somebody who has good reasons for going on living, who can enjoy the rest of their life, who gets benefits out of that. But I do think that we can understand better the ethic if we say, yes, but there are going to be some cases where this doesn't apply because the person is autonomously choosing and for good reasons to die now rather than in a few weeks or months.
But Peter, you haven't answered John's question.
No? Tell me why not.
Because what he asked you was, did you agree with me that if we legalise this, it will shift the foundational values of society?
No, I don't agree with that, because I think, in fact, we already have over some years shifted from the viewpoint that you're talking about. And it was interesting that you just mentioned, you said you don't want people to use the phrase the sanctity of life. But, of course, people did not very long ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago. That was a very commonly used expression. So the idea that was pretty much a dominant conception in our society, which did have those religious underpinnings. And as we have become a more secular society, and as we have also had raised more questions about the end of life, because we've had more medical technology that can keep people going for longer, whether that's good or bad, and therefore we've started to question that technological imperative of keep people alive at all costs. So I think we have shifted already quite significantly from that previous traditional sanctity of life ethic through to an ethic which is more aware of the significance of quality of life and choice.
Got one final question here. I'm sorry if your question didn't get up, but we are running out of time, and Margot has to catch a plane very soon. This is from Jennifer. I wish to outline that I am strongly pro-euthanasia. If this legislation is passed, how do you suggest that the legislation can safeguard in order to ensure that issues that happened overseas, such as insurance companies pushing euthanasia, will not happen here, and Victorians are protected by these issues experienced in other countries? That's to Peter Singer initially.
Yes, I'm not sure what the reference to insurance companies pushing euthanasia is, but here we have, we don't rely on private health insurance as people do in the United States. Some people do, not everybody, obviously. There is Medicaid for the poor, and there's Medicare for the elderly, and a lot of the people we're talking about are over 65 and eligible for Medicare. We do have a government system, and if the government were to start cutting off treatment and saying, no, you've got to have euthanasia, we're not going to treat you, I think that would be clearly a public decision that would be very hotly contested, and I can't see us anywhere near the kind of way of thinking that would accept that.
Any comment, Margaret?
No, not really on that one.
See, we've reached a quiet, sensible conclusion to our discussions. We have run out of time. It's close to 7:30. I'm very sorry if your questions didn't get up, but hasn't it been a privilege to have two people who have so immersed themselves seriously in these issues for much of their professional lives, Margaret Somerville and Professor Peter Singer? It's been great to have you with us. And it's time to hand back to Gabrielle McMullen.
Thank you, John. It's now my privilege to introduce the Chancellor of the University of Divinity, Dr. Graham Blackman AO. Dr. Blackman, who's provided distinguished service to the pharmaceutical industry, to scientific research and policy development, to the arts, the Anglican Church of Australia, and to the aged care sector, continues his generous community service as the University of Divinity's Foundation Chancellor. It's now my great pleasure to ask him to provide a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor McMullen, and ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you on behalf of the University, but more particular, may I thank our speakers, our illustrious speakers, for a splendid presentation of the issues and opening up the issues that we've heard tonight. I think everybody's going to go away from this knowing more about this challenging topic, and you've given us much to think about. So thank you very much indeed to both of our speakers. And may I say thank you to our splendid facilitator, John Cleary, who shared his own personal stories and was able to bring the issues to life. Could you please thank the three of our distinguished guests?
Thanks, Peter.
And just before we wrap up, just a couple of other thank yous, if I may. Particularly, I would like to thank our event coordinator, Meg Nelson. I would like to thank Dr. Gordon Preece, our relatively newly appointed director of the centre. It's good to have you with us, Gordon. May I also thank the Collins Street Baptist Church for their hospitality. May I thank St Athanasius College, who have provided the live streaming. This event is streaming out onto the web, so thank you to St Athanasius College, and thank you all for coming along. Thank you.